Matariki is the Māori name for the star cluster Pleiades, also known as the Seven Sisters. Matariki is also the name for an international network of 7 universities that are distinguished by their historic traditions and unique approach to facing contemporary challenges. The Matariki Lecture Series offers a short program of lectures addressing current research themes or areas of common interest.
This time, the lecture series is on race, racism, and decolonization, with a specific focus on decolonization.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you to everybody for joining us here today. Many thanks also, again, to my colleagues in the Matariki Network who've made this gathering possible and accessible for so many others. So the title of my talk today is Black Books, the Role of Black Studies at the University. In this talk, I'll briefly outline the overlapping histories of Black faculty, students, and community members at Queen's University in Kingston. I'll also address recent developments in research about Queen's Black history and the development of the Black Studies minor. And the snapshot that I present to you today is really indebted to work by people like Craig Stevens, Dr. Craig Stephen Wilder, particularly Ebony and Ivory, Race, Slavery, and the Troubled History of America's Universities, as well as more recent work set in Canadian contexts, like Afua Cooper's research on Lord Dalhousie's relationship to race and slavery, and the report that was generated from that work. So in Canada in recent years, we've seen an increased recognition of the fact that some of our post-secondary institutions have very complicated relationships to the systems of chattel slavery and systemic racism that we're used to understanding as happening elsewhere. And this year at Queen's, we've seen a cluster hire of new faculty members whose research and teaching will support the new minor in Black Studies, sort of a response to those new awakenings. But as in many places, I would argue that this flurry of activity is both fueled by and actually obscures the fact that there have been relatively few Black faculty members at Queen's for most of its history. And in fact, Queen's University did not welcome its first Black professor until the Civil Rights era. At that point, distinguished civil engineering professor, Dr. Barrington DeVere Batchelor, became the first Black professor. He was born in Jamaica and earned a PhD in civil engineering from the University of London's Imperial College of Science and Technology in 1963. And then DeVere Batchelor began working at the university in 1966. He taught civil engineering at Queen's for 27 years before retiring in 1993. So not very long ago, and actually, if you hang out long enough in Kingston, you'll probably meet a community member with very fond memories of Barry, as he's known locally. In addition to his long academic career, he was an outspoken advocate for racial justice and against police violence on campus, locally and nationally. And yet after Batchelor joined the university, Queen's recruitment of Black faculty members remained minimal, if not altogether negligible. And of course, one of the striking things about Batchelor's effective desegregation of the university is that it happened such a short time ago. In addition to this, as a Black feminist scholar, I'll also say that while the university actually has an official historian and has a number of students right now who are researching Black history at the university, to my knowledge, no research has been done to identify the first Black woman who was a professor at Queen's or the first Black female student. Nevertheless, we can say that Black faculty and staff at Queen's have maintained active research and service profiles here for many years. And so in 2017, the university announced a 5-year faculty renewal plan, which, while not ostensibly focused on Black representation, resulted in an increase in the number of Black faculty and staff on campus. In 2017, Dr. Catherine McKittrick, Dr. Beverly Mullings, and Associate Vice Principal of Human Rights, Equity, and Inclusion, Stephanie Simpson, agreed to create a listserv to connect Black faculty and staff at the university. We have a website now that actively invites, or when we actively invite and solicit new Black faculty and staff to sort of participate in both the website and the listserv to create at least a sense of virtual community and support. And our Black faculty and staff are nationally and internationally renowned. Members of Queen's Black Faculty and Staff Caucus have participated in national conversations about the relationship between Black Canadians and Canadian universities. And so, we're a small but mighty group. I turn now towards students because the history that I've told you is not usually what people think of when they think of Black folks at Queen's. And I do so reluctantly, in fact, because I think that there's a tendency to focus on the success of a select set of Black students, in fact, one student in particular, Robert Sutherland. And that tendency has allowed our institution to avoid reckoning with its own difficult relationship to Black communities and individuals. And yet, I would argue recent research developments highlight the way that Queen's University has long had a stake in Black intellectual culture, despite its own efforts. So I began working at Queen's in 2018, and as a new faculty member, I became fascinated by the figure of Robert Sutherland and his strange position on our campus. One that continues, a university campus that continues rather publicly to grapple with the practical implications of being known as both an elite academic space and a bastion of white privilege. Robert Sutherland troubles that legacy. So born in Jamaica in 1830, Robert Sutherland is renowned for his contributions to Queen's University. He's presumed to be the first Black student at Queen's University and the university's first Black graduate. He was also British North America's first Black lawyer. His posthumous financial donation to the university famously kept the university afloat. His legacy is outstanding on institutional and national levels. When I came to Queen's, I was struck by the fact that there's an endowed visitorship named for Sutherland, and although it's not specifically designated for Black scholars and intellectuals, past recipients have included people like David Austin, Lawrence Hill, and George Eliot Clark. There's a building named after him and a student prize named after him. And so Sutherland is often mentioned when people want to talk about Queen's relationship to Black people, particularly because Sutherland is said to have been struck by the fact that he was treated like a gentleman when he was a student at Queen's. And he probably was. It wouldn't have been unusual for a privileged Black person from the colonies to be educated abroad. And he may have been legible to others as just such a person, even as historians have questions around whether or not he was phenotypically Black. We don't know whether or not he was passing when he was a student. With these complicated histories in mind, in 2019, I began researching Sutherland, and I started some critical conversations with two university archivists, Heather Home and Deidre Bryan. I hired a research assistant to help them with a project that they had long been interested in which I also became fascinated with, and which I believe is sort of one of the things that we might prioritize at the university as we move forward. And it's the recovery of Robert Sutherland's library. You see, in addition to donating an incredibly generous sum of money to the university, Sutherland also donated his rather impressive library. In fact, at one point, his books comprised the majority of Queen's Library holdings. And Sutherland, I should say, is not the only donor whose books were deaccessioned or somehow failed to be cataloged in a systematic way. In fact, that there are a number of sort of lost libraries on record at the university. But this summer, in a moment of serendipity, a librarian from the Rare Books Library, who had also learned about the project, was able to actually go down into some of the stacks at the Rare Books Library and identify 3 books, one of which I am pleased to share with you today, or which I will actually attempt to share with you based on the success of my, Zoom skills. So let's see if it works. And so there it is. In some ways, it's sort of unremarkable and perhaps not what we would expect from somebody who has this kind of position in both Queen's history and in Black history in Canada, right? It's sort of it's just a practical treatise of office and duties of coroners in Upper Canada. But it doesn't have anything that would specifically delineate it as being significant to some of Sutherland's own interests. He was known in the community that he eventually settled in Waterloo, Ontario, as somebody who really went out of his way to advocate for Black immigrants, refugees from the United States, people who crossed the border and sort of settled in that area. But this is a practical, it's a practical book that certainly would have helped him in his work. So this is one of the books that he would have donated to the university. And the librarian was able to identify it because that is in fact his signature. And so one of the interesting things about Sutherland is that there are no extant photographs of him. So one of the things that becomes important when you're searching for Robert Sutherland is being able to identify his signature. Taken as individual items, the books in the library only tell a partial story. But I think that if we can figure out what Sutherland was reading, we might be able to make stronger claims about how his studies at Queen's impacted his life's work. If we can figure out what Sutherland was reading, we might be able to make claims about how his books impacted Queen's students in the 19th century and beyond. We do not yet know the full impact of his intellectual reach, and it will be years before we do, but we are getting there. So what do these books have to do with Black studies as it stands at Queen's, you might ask? I would point out that this collaboration happened because I'm a new Black faculty member in search of my own history at Queen's. So I would say that this research is actually a tangible outcome of hiring practices that prioritize Black faculty who work in the field of Black studies. The project itself of finding Robert Sutherland's library and the hiring in the field of Black studies continues. And the outcome of this work is hopeful but uncertain. What does it mean if we say that our very intellectual roots are born of work curated by an exceptional Black Canadian immigrant who became known for his work in the field of law and for his work on behalf of Black immigrants and refugees from the United States? The discovery of Robert Sutherland's library is a shocking fact that can serve to upend our understanding of Queen's relationship to Black intellectual thought, and in fact shift our own framing of the institution's relationship to Sutherland from one of a sort of colonial extraction, which places Sutherland and his material excess perilously close to the commodified labor and bodies of Black Jamaicans in the 19th century, to one of intellectual insurgency and generation. Robert Sutherland's books can form the basis of a rejuvenated understanding of the role of Black studies at Queen's now, its longue durée, and its depth. Robert Sutherland's library is a testament to the fact that our fortunes and our futures have long been intertwined. Thank you very much.